Anglo American's plans to restructure its platinum mine operations by shutting down 4 of those shafts and then, of course, as I said, retrenching 14,000 miners was met by a harsh response from government, with Minister Susan Shabangu saying an investigation would be launched to find out if Amplats complied with South Africa's mineral rights regulations. Joining us now to chat more about this is Justin Froneman, who's an analyst from SBG Securities. Thanks so much, Justin, for joining us this afternoon. Well, let's take a look at what's come through today. We've got these talks now starting off between Amplats and the South Africa, or the ministry itself. How encouraged are you by this? I mean, what should we be expecting over the next 90 days?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think it's an interesting situation that we find ourselves in, Alicia. I mean, fundamentally, this hasn't come as a surprise. I mean, Anglo Platinum have been working on this since February of last year, so it's almost been a year in the making. And I think it's been well documented the type of issues that the platinum sector in South Africa has obviously been facing, from loss-making shafts, and this probably certainly predates Marikana. So certainly from the financial crisis, the writing has been on the wall, and obviously this is an ultimate response to it. Investors fundamentally in the sector have been looking for some positive and strong action to come through from the companies. I suppose the disappointing factor has been, I suppose, the response that we've had from government and labour unions. It's relatively predictable, I think. But fundamentally, does it change anything in terms of what possibly has to happen on the ground? I think that's debatable and that's questionable. And certainly from our stance, we do think that Anglo Platinum has done the right thing. It's an incredibly difficult decision to make when you're talking about the number of people that are being involved here. But fundamentally, those shafts that they've flagged as being closed were not profitable. And ultimately, a decision had to be made.
Justin, what do you make of the response? You've mentioned the response of government and unions, and it seems to be rather a knee-jerk reaction, inappropriate and rather naive as well, because they said, well, you didn't tell us about this, this and this, but of course JSE regulations meant that Anglo American Platinum couldn't tell them because of corporate governance and disclosure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, once again, it shouldn't have come as any major surprise, I think, to anyone. I mean, they have been talking about it for a long time. I suppose there's a debate. The debatable point is whether or not, all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, and by the time that Anglo Platinum made the announcement. But I think it has been relatively disappointing. I mean, I think from our stance, there's a little bit of posturing obviously involved here, given the extent of the fallout and the numbers once again. But it doesn't do a lot, I think, to instill investor confidence out there that a company has made a difficult business decision and has been met with the type of resistance that it has. And it's going to be interesting to see what this 90-day process ultimately, what that ultimately leads us to. As you're well aware, the Section 189 process started on Tuesday in terms of notifying them. That's a 60-day process. So there is a bit of an overlap here in terms of notifying Labour about the restructurings and obviously what the DMR and the discussions that are taking place. But I do think that the reaction by Susan Shabangu was fairly interesting, obviously fairly outspoken, but once again, I don't know how much can really be done given the type of environment that Anglo American Platinum finds itself at this point in time.
So perhaps a little too late for Anglo Platinum, but as these negotiations or these talks happen with the mine itself, there are industry-wide negotiations and conversations that are happening in tandem. Yeah. Do you see this spelling better prospects moving forward for the mining industry as a whole?
Once again, I think it's a tough one. I mean, Anglo Plats, just by virtue of its size, has now become a quasi-swing producer in the industry, and it's really changed fundamentally its stance of how it approached the industry. So from an industry perspective, the type of shutdowns that we're seeing is very positive. It's taking metal out the market, and you've seen the platinum price and the palladium price react on the back of this type of development. So fundamentally, people like Impala, like Lomban, like Aquarius will obviously benefit quite substantially from this type of move. So Anglo Platinum really has quite a lot on its plate at the moment. There is a broad recognition, thankfully, that more has to be done in the sector from a governmental point of view and from a company involvement point of view. So I think you will find there's a lot more cooperation going forward. I think there's recognition, obviously, in terms of the numbers that the sector fundamentally employs. So from all those points of view, I do think that going forward, things will look better, but it is going to be a difficult decision to ultimately push through.
Justin, what about the big picture now? Those shafts that have been closed down on long-term care and maintenance and the Union mine up for sale, essentially. Does it sort of dangle a carrot to other mining operators, to maybe a state mining company, to say, we can't make these shafts work, we can't make this mine work, why don't you have a go and sell them off?
Yeah, I mean, I think something like a union is quite interesting because, as Amplats has already indicated, they do want to maximize value at that operation. It wasn't a loss-making operation on the basis of our numbers. It is a fairly sizable operation. So for them to make that decision, I think, does give a nice leg in for someone looking to enter the market. Once again, it is quite a sizable asset. You're looking at a 10 billion rand plus transaction taking place. In terms of operating the shafts that are to be shut down, it is going to be interesting to see if anyone does actually put their hand up to try and manage those operations and try and deal with them more effectively. I think one has to be cognizant that Anglo-American Platts does employ very good people, and it just, I think, tells you how difficult the environment fundamentally is, particularly around labour and around the labour inflation that we've seen. And so as a result, I think, although we are fully cognizant of the difficult decisions that have been made and the labour and everyone that's involved, it's obviously very traumatic. Permanent reduction in production is probably the best case scenario at this point in time, just given where this industry and this economy finds itself.
We've certainly got government shying away. I mean, we've had ANC Secretary General Gwede Mantashe saying yesterday already that they have no plans to nationalise these unsustainable mines, because if government takes over, what they're taking over is liability.
Absolutely. And you're taking over very, very difficult operating conditions. And if people like Impala or Amplats, and any of the major producers out there, if they can't make it work, given the type of fundamentals we're seeing, it just tells you how complicated and difficult things really have become. The industry, I wouldn't go as far as saying as the sunset industry per se, but there is a problem with yield, there's a problem with grade. It's a very labour intensive process, as I think most people are well aware. So in order to try and balance all these factors that are really happening at the moment, it becomes extremely difficult. And once again, these guys are good operators generally.